August 15, 1945. 1,200 hours. A radio crackles to life in a makeshift American intelligence compound outside Manila. The war is over. Emperor Hirohito's voice, never before heard by common citizens, announces Japan's surrender. But in a converted Catholic convent 40 miles north, Major Catherine Brennan of the Women's Army Corps stares at a classified report that will haunt her for the rest of her life. The document details something the history books would largely forget: 847 Japanese women, classified as civilian detainees, scattered across 12 Allied detention facilities in the Pacific. These weren't the comfort women the world would later mourn, nor were they military nurses or combatants. They were something entirely unexpected, the invisible casualties of a war that had no protocol for their existence. What happened to these women in the 18 months between surrender and their repatriation would challenge every assumption about warfare, gender, and humanity in the Pacific theater. This is their story, one buried in classified files, whispered about in veterans' memoirs, and largely erased from official histories. The Allied forces advancing through the Pacific Islands between 1944 and 1945 expected many things. They expected fanatical resistance. They expected booby traps and banzai charges. They expected death before surrender. What they did not expect was to find Japanese women in locations where, according to all intelligence assessments, no women should have been. The first significant group was discovered on February 28, 1945, during the liberation of Los Baños internment camp in the Philippines. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Muller's reconnaissance team, operating ahead of the main rescue force, stumbled upon a separate compound housing 73 Japanese women and 12 children. Official Army records describe the confusion that followed. These women weren't guards. They weren't prisoners of the Japanese. They were the wives, sisters, and daughters of Japanese civilian administrators who had been managing occupied territories. According to War Department documentation, the discovery created an immediate bureaucratic crisis. The Geneva Convention protocols that governed prisoner of war treatment had been written with male combatants in mind. The guidelines for civilian internees assumed European refugees, not enemy nationals from an Asian power. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, commanding the 6th Army, fired off an urgent cable to MacArthur's headquarters, request immediate guidance on disposition of Japanese female civilian detainees. No existing protocols apply. The problem multiplied as American forces swept through the Philippines, Okinawa, and the occupied Dutch East Indies. On Leyte, Marine intelligence officers found 34 Japanese women working as clerks in a naval supply depot. On Saipan, advancing Army units discovered 127 women and children hiding in caves, separated from military personnel who had committed suicide rather than surrender. Each discovery created the same legal and moral quandary. Major Brennan, who would eventually oversee the largest detention facility for these women, described the situation in her personal diary, now housed in the National Archives. "We've been trained to handle enemy soldiers. We've been trained to process refugees. But these women fit no category we understand. They are enemy nationals, yet they pose no military threat. They are civilians, yet they come from a nation that has shown no mercy to our civilians. They are women and children, yet they represent a regime we've been fighting to destroy." By April 1945, the War Department established a classification system that would determine these women's fate. Document WD-452B, declassified in 1972, created 3 categories. Category A, women with direct ties to Japanese military or intelligence operations. Category B, wives and family members of civilian administrators in occupied territories. Category C, women who had been living in occupied areas with no official government connection. The distinctions would prove crucial in determining treatment, detention conditions, and eventual repatriation. The mathematics of the situation grew starker with each passing week. By May 1945, Allied forces held 312 Japanese women across various facilities. By the end of June, that number had grown to 581. By the war's end on August 15, the total had reached 847 women and 203 children spread across 12 detention centers from Manila to Guam. The creation of detention protocols for Japanese women exposed a fundamental blindness in American military planning. The War Department had spent years preparing for every contingency of Pacific warfare, amphibious assaults, jungle combat, occupation governance, but no one had considered what to do with enemy women who were neither combatants nor traditional civilian refugees. Captain Eleanor Hutchison, assigned to the Provost Marshal's office in Manila, documented the bureaucratic chaos in official reports now preserved at the Military History Institute. Her August 1945 memorandum described the situation with stark clarity. "We have Japanese women detained under authority meant for prisoners of war, yet they are not combatants. We house them in facilities designed for Filipino internees, yet they are enemy nationals. We guard them with protocols written for male prisoners, yet they are women and children. Every regulation we apply is an improvisation." The first challenge was physical infrastructure. Existing POW camps had been designed for Japanese soldiers, with open bay barracks, communal latrines, and security measures appropriate for military prisoners. The detention of women and children required completely different considerations. Privacy, sanitation, medical care for pregnant women and infants, and protection from both external threats and from within the camps themselves. Major Brennan's facility at Camp Clayton, established in a former Philippine normal school outside Manila, became the largest detention center for Japanese women. War Department records show that between April and December 1945, the facility housed 394 Japanese women and 127 children. Brennan's daily logs, meticulously maintained and now declassified, reveal the unprecedented challenges. May 3, 1945, received 47 new detainees from Leyte. 12 are pregnant. Our medical staff has no experience with obstetric care. Have requested Navy medical personnel with appropriate training. Meanwhile, our doctor, Captain James Rutherford, is reading textbooks and hoping for the best. June 18, 1945, attempted to implement standard military meal schedule. The women refused to eat at prescribed times. They are cooking rice in their quarters using improvised methods that pose fire hazards. We lack interpreters who understand dietary requirements or cultural practices. Every meal becomes a negotiation. July 7, 1945, a delegation of Japanese women, led by a former teacher named Hanako Yamamoto, presented a formal petition requesting permission to establish a school for the children. The request is written in perfect English. The irony is not lost on me, we're denying education to children of a nation that denied freedom to millions. But our orders are clear: minimal accommodation, no privileges that could be construed as cooperation with enemy nationals. The psychological complexity of detention extended beyond physical conditions. American guards, many of them women from the Women's Army Corps, found themselves confronting their own prejudices and assumptions. Corporal Dorothy Vincennes from Ohio kept a diary throughout her service at Camp Clayton. Her entries, donated to the Veterans History Project in 1998, capture the cognitive dissonance. August 2, 1945, today I watched the Japanese women celebrating what they call Tanabata, some kind of star festival. They made decorations from scraps of paper and sang songs to their children. I found myself crying. These are supposed to be the enemy. The same people responsible for Bataan, for Pearl Harbor, for everything we've been fighting against. But watching them with their children, I see my own mother, my own sisters. War makes monsters of us all by demanding we forget our common humanity. The three-category classification system established by War Department document WD-452B would determine not just detention conditions, but the very survival prospects of hundreds of Japanese women. The system, created in haste by bureaucrats thousands of miles from the Pacific Theater, failed to account for the complex realities these women represented. Category A detainees, those identified as having direct military or intelligence connections, numbered only 23 women across all facilities. Investigation files from the Counterintelligence Corps, declassified in 1983, reveal the thin evidence often used to justify this classification. One woman, Reiko Watanabe, was designated Category A solely because she had worked as a secretary for the Osaka municipal government's public works department before the war. The classification form noted, subject possessed typing and stenography skills. May have had access to documents of intelligence value. The fact that she had been typing road maintenance reports was deemed irrelevant. Category A designation carried severe consequences. These women were segregated from general detention populations, subjected to regular interrogation, denied access to Red Cross packages, and placed last on any repatriation lists. Army intelligence documents show that the 23 Category A women were interrogated an average of 47 times each between August 1945 and June 1946. The interrogation reports, stamped confidential and buried in archives for decades, revealed the futility of this process. Of 1,081 total interrogation sessions, 1,063 produced no intelligence of any value. Category B represented the largest group, 673 women classified as family members of civilian administrators in occupied territories. These were wives of government officials, postal workers, schoolteachers, and civil engineers who had been sent to manage Japanese-occupied regions. The War Department's logic was clear: these women had benefited from Japan's imperial expansion and should be detained until their husbands' or fathers' complicity could be assessed. Lieutenant Patricia Morrison, assigned as liaison officer for Category B detainees at Camp Clayton, described the arbitrary nature of these classifications in her after-action report. I interviewed a woman, Fumiko Tanaka, whose husband had been a postal clerk in Manila. She had lived there for 8 months before the American liberation. We detained her and her 3 children for 14 months while investigating whether her husband had administrative complicity in the occupation. The investigation concluded he had sorted mail. This woman and her children spent over a year behind barbed wire because her husband had been a mailman. Category C, the smallest group at 151 women, covered those who had been living in occupied territories with no official government connection. These included teachers who had volunteered for positions in occupied schools, merchants' wives, and women who had simply followed their families to territories Japan had conquered. The classification should have guaranteed the quickest repatriation, but the reality proved far more complicated. The classification system created a hierarchy of suffering within the detention camps. Category A women, isolated and repeatedly interrogated, developed what camp medical officers described as interrogation fatigue syndrome, a condition characterized by paranoia, insomnia, and severe anxiety. Category B women, comprising the majority, lived in a state of indefinite limbo, not knowing when or if they would ever return to Japan. Category C women, theoretically the most fortunate, often faced the greatest identity crisis, questioning whether they even belonged in Japan anymore after years living abroad. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The turning point in the treatment of Japanese female detainees came from an unexpected source: American women who had themselves survived Japanese internment camps. In September 1945, a group of 14 former civilian internees from Santo Tomas and Los Baños, all American and European women who had endured 3 years of captivity under Japanese occupation, petitioned General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters with a request that stunned military officials. The petition, preserved in MacArthur's personal papers at the MacArthur Memorial Archives, stated, "We, the undersigned former internees of Japanese detention facilities in the Philippine Islands, hereby request permission to visit and assess conditions at Camp Clayton and other facilities currently housing Japanese female detainees. Having experienced detention ourselves, we believe we possess unique insight into the humanitarian requirements necessary for such facilities." Colonel Frank Randolph, MacArthur's Chief of Staff for Civil Affairs, initially recommended denying the request. His memo, dated September 18, 1945, argued, to allow former victims of Japanese cruelty to visit facilities housing Japanese nationals creates unacceptable risks of confrontation and revenge. The optics are untenable. But MacArthur, in a decision that would remain controversial, approved the visits. His handwritten note on the denial recommendation read simply, "If we become what we fought against, We have lost regardless of military victory. Approve the request with appropriate security measures. The first visit occurred on October 3, 1945. Virginia Hewlett, a former missionary who had spent 38 months in Santo Tomas internment camp, led a delegation of 6 women to Camp Clayton. Major Brennan's diary entry from that day captures the tension. I have never been more anxious about any inspection. These women suffered genuine horrors under Japanese detention. I feared violence, confrontation, or at minimum, harsh judgment that would validate the most punitive policies toward our detainees. What happened instead transformed the entire approach to Japanese female detention. Hewlett's official report, submitted to MacArthur's headquarters on October 15, 1945, detailed systematic deficiencies in Camp Clayton's operations. The report's language was precise and devastating: medical facilities inadequate for obstetric care, sanitation provisions insufficient for the population density, nutritional standards below minimum requirements for nursing mothers and growing children, educational provisions for children non-existent, mental health resources completely absent. The report continued with a comparison that made military officials deeply uncomfortable. We observed conditions that, while not approaching the deliberate cruelty we experienced under Japanese detention, nevertheless fall below the standards we would expect the United States to maintain. The women and children detained at Camp Clayton are receiving approximately 1,800 calories per day. We received less during our internment, but we expected cruelty from our captors. These detainees should expect better from us. Hewlett's recommendations were comprehensive and immediate. Increase daily caloric intake to 2,400 calories for women, 2,800 for nursing mothers. Establish proper medical facilities with trained obstetric personnel. Create educational programs for children. Provide mental health resources. Allow limited self-governance within the camps. Permit cultural and religious practices that posed no security threat. The impact was swift. On October 28, 1945, MacArthur's headquarters issued General Order 247, implementing most of Hewlett's recommendations across all detention facilities housing Japanese women. The order marked a fundamental shift from viewing these women primarily as enemy nationals to recognizing them as human beings entitled to basic dignity regardless of their nation's actions. Major Brennan recorded the changes in her November 1 diary entry. Today we increased meal rations, opened the makeshift school, and allowed the women to establish their own internal governance committee. The change in atmosphere is remarkable. The women had been existing in a state of fearful passivity. Now they are organizing, planning, teaching their children, and engaging with us as human beings rather than jailers. Virginia Hewlett has accomplished in 1 month what I failed to do in 6. The 203 children detained alongside their mothers represented perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire detention system. These children, ranging from infants born in custody to teenagers who remembered pre-war life, existed in a legal and moral gray zone that exposed the limitations of military justice and international law. Captain Sarah Donnelly, a former elementary school teacher from Massachusetts who had joined the Women's Army Corps, was assigned as education officer for Camp Clayton in November 1945. Her appointment came directly from the implementation of General Order 247. Donnelly's personal papers, donated to the Women in Military Service for America Memorial in 1994, provide extraordinary insight into the children's experiences. Her first diary entry as education officer, dated November 8, 1945, described her initial assessment. I counted 73 children of school age among the detainees. The youngest is 6, the oldest is 15. They have received no formal education since their detention began, some for as long as 18 months. They are being raised behind barbed wire, watching their mothers live in fear and uncertainty. They are learning that the world is divided into guards and prisoners, that authority means coercion, and that their identity as Japanese makes them enemies even as children. The establishment of the camp school on November 15, 1945, created immediate complications. The War Department had authorized education but provided no guidance on curriculum. Should these children be taught in Japanese or English? Should the curriculum include Japanese cultural content or focus solely on practical skills? Should American values be promoted, or would that constitute indoctrination of enemy children? Donnelly's solution was pragmatic and revolutionary. She recruited Hanako Yamamoto, the former teacher who had petitioned for a school months earlier, as the lead instructor. Together, they created a bilingual curriculum that taught basic mathematics, literacy in both Japanese and English, science, and what Donnelly called universal moral principles, lessons on kindness, honesty, and mutual respect that transcended national identity. The school operated in a converted storage building with salvaged materials. Chalkboards were made from painted wood panels. Textbooks were created by hand using paper from military supplies. Teaching materials included whatever could be improvised from camp resources. Despite these limitations, attendance was universal. Every school-age child attended every day. Lieutenant Morrison, observing the school's operations in December 1945, filed a report that captured the surreal nature of the situation. I watched American guards standing watch while Japanese children sang songs in their native language, learning lessons about Japanese folklore and tradition. 6 months ago, we were fighting to destroy everything these children represent. Now we are enabling the preservation of their culture and identity. The cognitive dissonance is profound, yet somehow this feels more aligned with American values than anything else we've done in this detention facility. The children's experiences vary dramatically based on age. Young children, particularly those under 8, adapted with remarkable resilience. They played games with improvised toys, formed friendships across family groups, and treated the camp as simply the world they knew. Donnelly's notes from February 1946 described a birthday party for 6-year-old Kenji Matsumoto. The children fashioned decorations from scraps. The mothers pooled their rations to create a small cake. They sang songs and played games. For 2 hours, the barbed wire disappeared, and these children were simply children celebrating a friend's birthday. Older children and teenagers faced more complex psychological challenges. 15-year-old Akira Nakamura, who spoke fluent English, served as an interpreter for camp administration. His diary, confiscated during a routine security inspection but later returned and preserved, revealed the internal conflict of adolescence compounded by detention. The announcement of Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, should have marked the beginning of the end for the detention of Japanese women. Instead, it initiated a bureaucratic nightmare that would extend their captivity by more than a year and expose the complete absence of planning for their return. The Repatriation Planning Committee, established by MacArthur's headquarters on August 20, 1945, initially projected that all Japanese civilians would be returned to Japan by December 1945. Document RPC 114, declassified in 1989, outlined a straightforward plan. Transport ships would move Japanese military prisoners and civilian detainees to designated ports in Japan, where Japanese authorities would receive them and facilitate their return to home regions. The plan collapsed within weeks. Japan in late 1945 was a nation in ruins. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with conventional bombing campaigns that had destroyed 66 major cities, had eliminated much of the infrastructure needed to receive and process returning civilians. Food shortages threatened mass starvation. Transportation networks were shattered. Local governments were barely functioning. Colonel Thomas Wickham, assigned as Chief Repatriation Officer for civilian detainees, documented the crisis in his September 1945 report. The Japanese government has informally communicated that it cannot guarantee the safety or survival of repatriated civilians, particularly women and children without male family members. The nation's resources are completely dedicated to preventing mass starvation of the existing population. Adding thousands of returnees would overwhelm their capacity. The situation was further complicated by the status of the detainees' male relatives. Many of the husbands, fathers, and brothers of the detained women were themselves held in military POW camps or had died during the war. Some were being held for war crimes investigations. Others were simply missing, their fates unknown. The women faced the prospect of returning to a devastated nation with no support system and no means of survival. Major Brennan's diary entries from late 1945 captured the growing desperation. October 22, informed the women today that repatriation has been postponed indefinitely. The announcement caused several women to collapse. Fumiko Tanaka, who has been detained for 16 months, began screaming that we had promised release after the war ended. She is correct. We did promise. Now I must tell her that she and her children will spend Christmas behind barbed wire because we have nowhere to send them. The psychological impact of indefinite detention after war's end proved devastating. Camp medical records from November and December 1945 documented a surge in what doctors termed post-surrender depression syndrome. Women who had maintained composure during active warfare collapsed emotionally when faced with continued captivity during peacetime. Suicide attempts increased. Medical personnel reported that 12 women attempted self-harm in November alone, compared to 3 total attempts during the previous 6 months of war. The International Red Cross, which had maintained limited contact with the detention facilities during the war, intensified its involvement after Japan's surrender. Delegate Friedrich Kellerman visited Camp Clayton on November 30, 1945. His report, filed with Red Cross headquarters in Geneva, described the situation with diplomatic but unmistakable criticism. These women and children are being detained without charges, without trial, and now without the justification of ongoing warfare. They exist in legal limbo, neither prisoners of war entitled to POW protections, nor civilian internees with clearly defined rights. The United States government must resolve this situation immediately. The pressure from international humanitarian organizations, combined with growing media attention, finally forced action. On December 15, 1945, the War Department announced the phased repatriation program. The plan divided returnees into priority groups based on family situation, health status, and length of detention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The SS Marine Falcon departed Manila Harbor on January 18, 1946, carrying the first group of Japanese women and children to be repatriated under the phased repatriation program. The ship's manifest, preserved in Naval Transportation Service records, listed 127 women and 48 children, all Category C detainees who had been cleared for immediate return. Major Brennan stood on the dock that morning, watching women she had guarded for nearly a year walk up the gangplank toward an uncertain future. Her diary entry from that day revealed the complexity of emotions surrounding the departure. I watched Fumiko Tanaka board with her 3 children. 16 months ago, we detained her because her husband sorted mail for the Japanese Postal Service in occupied Manila. Today, she's returning to a country she hasn't seen in 4 years, to a city that may no longer exist, to find a husband who may be dead. She thanked me as she left. I don't know what to do with that gratitude. I was her jailer, not her protector. The journey to Japan took 6 days. Navy records document that the Marine Falcon sailed with minimal escort, as submarine threats had been eliminated. The women and children were housed in converted cargo holds fitted with temporary bunks. Medical personnel accompanied the voyage to manage the expected seasickness and monitor the health of pregnant women and young children. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, the ship's executive officer, maintained a detailed log of the voyage. His entries, declassified in 1995, revealed the women's emotional state as they approached Japan. January 22. As we near Japanese waters, the mood among the returnees has shifted from relief to anxiety. Many women are asking if we have information about specific cities, neighborhoods, whether their homes still exist. We have no answers. Weather reports indicate we should arrive Yokohama on the 24th, assuming port facilities are operational. The arrival at Yokohama on January 24, 1946, exposed the full scope of Japan's devastation. The port city, once a thriving commercial center of 900,000 people, had been reduced to rubble by American firebombing raids. Commander Hayes's log described the scene. Yokohama is destroyed. Perhaps 15% of structures remain standing. The port facilities are minimally operational, a few piers, some temporary buildings, evidence of reconstruction efforts, but the scale of destruction is overwhelming. The women on deck fell silent when they saw their homeland. Several began weeping. One woman, perhaps 40 years old, simply repeated USO, USO, lies, lies, as though refusing to accept what her eyes showed her. The reception process at Yokohama revealed another challenge no one had anticipated. Japanese officials, operating from temporary buildings near the waterfront, were overwhelmed by the task of processing returnees. The bureaucracy required to verify identities, locate surviving family members, and arrange onward transportation exceeded their limited capacity. Women who had expected to be home within days found themselves in temporary shelters near the port, sometimes for weeks. Captain Donnelly, who had accompanied the first repatriation ship as a liaison officer, filed a report on February 3, 1946, that detailed the breakdown in Japanese reception infrastructure. The returnees are being housed in a converted warehouse with minimal facilities. Japanese authorities are doing their best, but they lack resources, transportation, and personnel. Women are sleeping on concrete floors with single blankets. Food is rice gruel twice daily. The children are asking why they left one camp only to arrive at another. I have no answer that makes sense. The International Red Cross established a presence at Yokohama specifically to assist returnees. Delegate Margarethe Hoffman's reports from February 1946 documented her efforts to connect women with surviving family members and facilitate their movement to home regions. Her February 15 report noted, of the 127 women returned on the first ship, 89 have now departed for home regions. 38 remain in Yokohama, either because their home cities are completely destroyed or because they have been unable to locate any surviving relatives. These women exist in a peculiar state, free from American detention but trapped in their devastated homeland with nowhere to go. The fate of these 38 women would become symbolic of the larger tragedy. They had survived war, detention, and repatriation only to find themselves homeless in their own country. Some eventually relocated to rural areas where food was more available. Others remained in Yokohama's ruins, joining the thousands of displaced Japanese struggling to survive in the immediate post-war period. Their stories, documented in fragmentary Red Cross reports and occasional letters, traced paths through the chaos of defeated Japan, working in reconstruction efforts, searching for lost relatives, and attempting to rebuild lives from absolute zero. As repatriation ships departed Manila through the spring of 1946, a troubling reality emerged: not all detained Japanese women wanted to return to Japan. By April 1946, 64 women had formally petitioned American authorities for permission to remain in the Philippines or emigrate to other destinations. Their requests created legal and diplomatic complications that military officials were completely unprepared to handle. The petitions came from women whose circumstances made return to Japan either impossible or potentially fatal. War Department document WD-738F, declassified in 1987, categorized these cases into 4 distinct groups. The first group consisted of 23 women who had married Filipino men before or during the occupation. These women faced potential prosecution in Japan under wartime laws that had prohibited marriage to non-Japanese nationals in occupied territories. Teresa Nakamura, born Reiko Sato, had married Filipino merchant Antonio Nakamura in 1942. Her petition, filed on March 15, 1946, explained her situation with heartbreaking clarity: I am legally married under Philippine law to a Filipino citizen. My husband survived the occupation in hiding. He has petitioned for my release. But if I return to Japan, my marriage will not be recognized, and I will be prosecuted for fraternizing with enemy nationals during wartime. I am trapped between 2 nations, belonging fully to neither. The second group included 18 women who had converted to Christianity during their detention, many through interactions with American military chaplains or missionary visitors. These conversions, documented in chaplain reports preserved at the Army Chaplain Corps Historical Center, carried severe social stigma in post-war Japan. Some women feared ostracism or worse if they returned home as Christian converts. Private correspondence from Chaplain Robert Morrison described one such case: I baptized Yuki Hayashi on December 8, 1945. She had been studying Christianity for 5 months, attending services, reading scripture, and asking profound theological questions. Her faith is genuine and transformative. But she tells me that returning to her village as a Christian would make her an outcast. Her family would disown her. She has asked if there is any way she might remain in the Philippines or relocate to a Christian nation. I have no answer to give her. The third group consisted of 15 women who had been victims of sexual assault during the confusion of the Japanese surrender and American liberation. These women carried pregnancies fathered by unknown assailants, some Japanese soldiers, some Filipino insurgents, some possibly even American personnel. Returning to Japan while pregnant with a child of uncertain paternity would guarantee social destruction. Major Brennan's April 22, 1946 diary entry addressed this tragedy. Met today with 7 pregnant women who have petitioned to remain. None will identify the circumstances of their pregnancies. The shame is overwhelming. In Japan, they would be considered ruined, their children eternal outcasts. They are asking if we can help them settle somewhere, anywhere, other than Japan. The irony is bitter. We detain them against their will. Now some are begging not to be released. The fourth group numbered 8 women who simply stated they had no one and nothing to return to in Japan. Their families were dead, their homes destroyed, and their prospects for survival negligible. These women explicitly requested permission to remain in Allied custody indefinitely rather than face certain destitution in Japan. The legal framework for handling these petitions simply did not exist. The women were classified as enemy nationals subject to mandatory repatriation under existing treaties. But forcing repatriation on women who faced persecution or death seemed to violate the humanitarian principles the United States claimed to uphold. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, the State Department, and the War Department engaged in months of bureaucratic debate while the petitioning women remained in detention. Captain Eleanor Hutchison, now serving as Chief Liaison for Special Cases, documented the bureaucratic paralysis in her May 1946 report. We have created Kafkaesque situations where women are simultaneously petitioning for release from detention and requesting to remain in our custody. They want freedom but cannot accept repatriation. We lack any legal mechanism to resolve these contradictions. So they wait, living in limbo, while bureaucrats in Washington debate jurisdiction and precedent. The eventual resolution came through a series of individual exceptions rather than systematic policy. Some women received special dispensations to remain in the Philippines under Filipino government supervision. Others were granted humanitarian immigration exceptions to relocate to Allied nations. A few cases were simply closed administratively, with women released into Manila's population without formal documentation, becoming effectively stateless persons. By August 1946, all formal petitions had been resolved one way or another. But the resolutions often amounted to passing responsibility from military to civilian authorities without actually solving the underlying problems these women faced. The last Japanese woman departed American detention on November 3, 1946, 847 days after the first women were detained in February 1945. Major Catherine Brennan, who had overseen Camp Clayton through its entire existence, recorded the facility's closure in her final diary entry. Today we released Hanako Yamamoto, the teacher who petitioned for a school, who taught the children, who maintained dignity through 18 months of detention. She thanked me again. I still don't know what to do with that gratitude. We took 2 years of her life, and she thanks me for treating her humanely within that theft. The moral arithmetic doesn't balance. The official records of Japanese female detention in World War II are remarkably sparse given the significance of what occurred. The War Department's final statistical report, compiled in December 1946, reduced the entire experience to numbers: 847 women detained, 203 children, 12 facilities, 847 days maximum detention, 0 escapes, 0 major security incidents, 64 special case petitions. Total cost to U.S. taxpayers $2.3 million. But the human story contained in those statistics proved far more complex and far more significant than official documentation suggested. The Detention of Japanese Women exposed fundamental tensions in how America conducted war, tensions between military necessity and humanitarian principles, between vengeance and justice, between seeing enemies as threats and recognizing them as human beings. The women who returned to Japan carried their detention experiences into post-war Japanese society, though few spoke openly about what they had endured. Cultural stigma surrounding capture and detention meant that many women never told their own families the complete truth about where they had been during the war's final years. They had been trained by Japanese militarism to view surrender and capture as ultimate shame, and post-war society reinforced that view. Research conducted by Keio University historian Dr. Takeshi Yamada in the 1980s attempted to locate and interview former detainees. His published findings in 1989 documented that of 127 women he successfully located, only 31 agreed to be interviewed, and most of those refused to allow their real names to be published. One woman, identified only as Mrs. K, told Dr. Yamada, "For 40 years, I have told people I was in the countryside during the final year of the war. It is easier than explaining that I was detained by the Americans. People assume I was a comfort woman or worse. The truth is complicated, and Japan prefers simple stories about the war." The American personnel who operated the detention facilities carried their own complex legacies. Major Brennan returned to teaching in Pennsylvania, rarely discussing her wartime service. Captain Donnelly became a school principal and advocate for international understanding. Lieutenant Morrison worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, applying lessons from Camp Clayton to post-war refugee crises. Most of the enlisted women who served as guards simply returned to civilian life in private silence. Virginia Hewlett, the former internee who had transformed the detention system, spent the remainder of her life advocating for humanitarian treatment of detainees regardless of nationality. She testified before Congress in 1951 during Korean War detention policy debates and in 1971 regarding Vietnam War POW treatment. In a 1978 interview for the Veterans History Project, she reflected, "My experience in Japanese detention camps taught me about cruelty. My experience visiting Camp Clayton taught me about the constant vigilance required to prevent ourselves from becoming what we fight against. The distance between just detention and abuse is smaller than we want to believe." The children of detention represent perhaps the most enduring legacy. Those who were young enough to not fully remember their time behind barbed wire often learned about it only decades later when family histories were finally discussed. Some discovered their birth certificates listed Camp Clayton as their birthplace. The psychological impact of early childhood detention, even when not consciously remembered, influenced patterns of anxiety, attachment, and identity formation that researchers are only now beginning to understand. In 2015, 70 years after the war's end, the Japanese government quietly erected a small memorial at Yokohama port honoring civilian returnees who suffered hardship during repatriation. The memorial makes no specific mention of detention by Allied forces, reflecting Japan's ongoing reluctance to address the complexities of its wartime history. But for the few surviving women who had been detained, the memorial represented a form of acknowledgement, however indirect. The story of Japanese female POWs in World War II remains largely absent from popular histories of the Pacific War. The narratives we tell about that conflict focus on combat heroism, strategic decisions, and the atomic bombs that ended it. But in the spaces between those major events, 847 women and their children experienced a different war, one of bureaucratic confusion, unexpected humanity, and moral complexity that defied simple categorization as either justice or cruelty. Their experience reminds us that war's impact extends far beyond battlefields, and that how we treat those we have power over defines us as clearly as how we fight those who oppose us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.